At 11:47 p.m. on March 14th, 1943, Lieutenant Henrik Andersen crouched in the forward hold of a converted fishing trawler 12 nautical miles off the Norwegian coast, watching through a gap in the hull planking as searchlight beams from 3 German patrol boats swept across black water less than 800 meters away, the salt spray freezing against his face in the sub-zero wind. His vessel, the Shuffle, carried 17 resistance fighters in a cargo hold that shouldn't have held more than fish, using a technique so simple that Naval Command in London had literally laughed when he'd proposed it. Canvas partitions soaked in diesel fuel to mask human scent from patrol dogs, combined with a deliberate engine misfire pattern that mimicked a struggling civilian vessel. The nearest safe harbor lay 23 kilometers to the northwest, but German coastal radar stations tracked every vessel within 30 kilometers of shore, and radio intercepts confirmed enemy destroyers would sweep this sector within 90 minutes. In the next 4 minutes, either Andersen's improvised deception would convince the patrol boats his trawler was just another desperate fisherman hunting for cod in restricted waters, or 17 of Norway's most valuable intelligence operatives would die in the hold of a boat the Royal Navy had dismissed as tactically worthless. They said a carpenter's son from Bergen with no naval academy. Training couldn't outsmart the Kriegsmarine, but observation beats credentials when survival demands innovation. The searchlight held on the Shuffle for 3 seconds, then 4. The diesel engine coughed and sputtered exactly as Andersen had calibrated it, a rhythm that sounded like desperation, not deception. Through the planking gap, he could see the patrol boats wake, changing direction, turning away, dismissing them. Just another Norwegian fisherman, too stubborn or too stupid to obey the coastal blockade. The moment crystallized what Henrik Andersen had been trying to prove for 18 months, that the best way to hide 17 resistance fighters from the most sophisticated naval detection system in occupied Europe was to pretend you weren't hiding anyone at all. Not through sophisticated technology, not through naval tactics taught at academies, through understanding that German patrol commanders expected smugglers to act like criminals, quiet, fast, desperate to avoid contact. So Andersen did the opposite. He acted like every other fishing boat captain in Norway, loud, slow, and too poor to care about regulations. The technique had a name among the handful of resistance coordinators who knew about it, though British naval intelligence refused to use the term in official reports because it sounded absurd. Aggressive innocence. The concept was simple: maintain such obvious, flagrant civilian behavior that military patrols would waste resources investigating you. Find nothing suspicious after cursory checks, and categorize your vessel as a known nuisance rather than a potential threat. Each subsequent patrol encounter would be shorter, less thorough. Within 6 crossings, you'd be invisible. Tonight was crossing number 7. The irony wasn't lost on Andersen. Before the war, he'd built fishing boats in his father's shipyard in Bergen. Small vessels, working-class craft, nothing sophisticated. When Germany invaded in April 1940, he'd volunteered for coastal defense. The Navy had rejected him insufficient education, no command experience. So he'd done what carpenters do. He'd improvised. By late 1941, he was running refugees to Britain in a refitted trawler. By early 1942, he was smuggling Allied operatives into Norway. By March 1943, he was transporting some of the most valuable intelligence assets in Scandinavia, using a boat that cost less than a staff car and tactics that violated every principle taught at naval warfare schools. British Special Operations executive called it unprofessional but effective. The Royal Navy's assessment was less diplomatic. Reckless civilian improvisation with no tactical doctrine. Norwegian resistance leadership had a simpler description. It works when nothing else does. The Shuffle continued its labored progress toward shore, engine misfiring in perfect rhythm. Below deck, 17 resistance fighters waited in silence, breathing through canvas filters, their presence masked by layers of diesel-soaked fabric and the overwhelming stench of old fish. Somewhere in that hold was intelligence that could map every German coastal defense position between Trondheim and Stavanger. Information worth more than a dozen destroyers. All of it dependent on a carpenter who'd convinced patrol boats he was too incompetent to be a threat. The searchlight swept past one final time, then moved on. Anderson allowed himself one slow breath. Not relief, not yet, but acknowledgement. They'd crossed the first threshold. 12 kilometers to shore. 17 lives. One ridiculous technique that kept working because nobody believed it could. This is the story of how an underestimated fishing boat captain with no formal naval training developed a smuggling technique so counterintuitive that it fooled the Kriegsmarine for 2 years and changed how Allied intelligence operations approached occupied coastal territories. They called it aggressive innocence. History would call it one of the most successful small vessel resistance operations of World War II. Henrik Andersen was 28 years old when Norway fell to Germany in April 1940. Born in Bergen to a shipwright father and a schoolteacher mother, he'd grown up in the shadow of the Briggen waterfront, where fishing vessels crowded the harbor and the smell of cod processing mixed with diesel fumes and salt air. His education had ended at 16, not from lack of intelligence, but from economic necessity. His father's shipyard needed labor. Henrik provided it. By 20, he could rebuild a fishing trawler's engine blindfolded. By 25, he designed modifications that made aging vessels more fuel efficient. By the time war came, he was running his father's business, building and maintaining the small craft that fed Bergen's working-class families. The Norwegian Navy didn't want carpenters. They wanted academy graduates, officers, men who understood naval warfare doctrine and could command with authority derived from credentials and rank. Henrik Andersen had work-roughened hands, a basic education, and a tendency to explain complex mechanical concepts using fishing metaphors. When he'd volunteered for coastal defense in May 1940, the recruiting officer had been polite but firm. "We need trained sailors, not shipwrights." So Andersen had gone back to Bergen, watched German troops patrol his streets, and continued repairing fishing boats. Except now, some of those repairs included hidden compartments, false hulls, modified engines that could switch between legitimate fishing speeds and something considerably faster when patrol boats weren't watching. By October 1940, he was smuggling refugees, small runs, 5 or 6 people at a time, short distances, Bergen to Shetland, usually. The trips were dangerous, but straightforward. Stay dark, stay quiet, move fast. Standard smuggler doctrine. The first time he got stopped by a German patrol boat, he nearly got everyone killed. It was November 1940, 3 nautical miles off the coast, running dark with 8 refugees below deck. The patrol boat came out of the fog doing 20 knots, searchlight already sweeping. Andersen had cut his engine, dropped speed, tried to look like a drifting fishing vessel. The Germans weren't fooled. They'd pulled alongside, demanded inspection, sent 2 armed sailors aboard. Andersen had frozen, 8 people below deck, barely breathing. One sound, one mistake, everyone dies. The German inspection had been cursory below deck, quick sweep with flashlights, nothing found. But Andersen had seen the suspicious looks, the way the patrol commander had marked his vessel on a chart, the verbal warning that fishing in military zones would result in detention next time. They'd let him go. He'd made it to Shetland, delivered the refugees. But the encounter haunted him. Because the Germans hadn't been convinced, they'd been suspicious, they'd filed a report. Next time, the inspection would be more thorough. Eventually, probability would catch him. That night, sitting in a Shetland safe house, Andersen had a thought that would reshape how he approached every subsequent crossing. What if he stopped trying to avoid patrol boats? The idea seemed insane. Every smuggler, every resistance operative, every intelligence briefing emphasized the same principle: avoid detection. But Andersen kept thinking about that patrol boat commander's expression: suspicious, alert, treating every coastal vessel as a potential threat. What if, instead of acting like a smuggler trying to avoid detection, he acted like an actual Norwegian fisherman who genuinely didn't care about German regulations? Not defiant, Not aggressive, just indifferent. The kind of working-class stubbornness that treated military blockades like weather, an inconvenience to work around, not a threat to hide from. Over the next 3 months, Anderson tested variations of the concept. Instead of running dark, he kept his navigation lights on. Instead of avoiding patrol boats, he maintained course even when searchlights swept over him. Instead of polite compliance when stopped, he argued, complained about lost fishing time, demanded compensation for fuel wasted during inspections. He acted, in other words, exactly like the dozens of legitimate Norwegian fishing captains who genuinely were just trying to catch enough cod to feed their families. The results were remarkable. Patrol boats started recognizing his vessel. After the 3rd or 4th stop, inspections became perfunctory. By crossing number 10, some patrol commanders would just wave him through with verbal warnings. The Sjöfugl was categorized as a known nuisance, a stubborn fishing captain who kept violating regulations because he couldn't afford not to fish. By early 1941, Anderson was making regular runs. Refugees going out, intelligence operatives coming in, small cargo radio equipment, weapons, documents. Nothing huge, but consistent, reliable. British intelligence noticed. By June 1941, Special Operations Executive was using him for low-priority insertions. Not elite commandos, those got submarines or flying boats, but local agents, resistance coordinators, people who needed to get into Norway without the resources allocated to high-value operations. The assignments were simple. Pick up an operative from a fishing village. Transport them to another village, 20 kilometers up the coast. Or collect intelligence packages from resistance cells, deliver them to SOE handlers in Shetland. Routine work, but essential. And still, Anderson kept refining his technique. He realized that patrol boats didn't just look for suspicious behavior, they responded to patterns. A vessel that appeared once was unknown, appeared twice, potentially suspicious, but appeared 15, 20 times, always with the same captain, always fishing in the same areas, always with the same annoyed attitude when stopped. That became part of the landscape. Furniture, expected. He deliberately cultivated a reputation. Crews on patrol boats started recognizing him. Some learned his name. They'd joke about the stubborn Norwegian who kept ignoring the blockade. They'd place bets on how many times per month he'd get stopped. This was aggressive innocence. Not hiding, not disguising, but being so consistently, mundanely civilian that military patrols stopped treating him as a security concern. The professional naval officers in British command found the whole thing absurd. "You're not conducting covert operations," one SOE coordinator had told him in early 1942. "You're being deliberately visible. That's tactically backwards." Anderson's response had been simple. "How many submarines has the Kriegsmarine caught this year?" 17. "How many fishing boats have they detained for smuggling since I started?" "I don't have that data." 47. "Not including mine. They catch submarines because submarines try to be invisible. They catch smugglers because smugglers try to hide. They don't catch fishing captains who complain about fuel costs." The logic was sound, but it violated conventional doctrine. Covert operations required concealment. Everyone knew that. It was fundamental to special operations theory. Except Anderson kept proving it wrong. By mid-1942, he was running 1 successful crossing per week, sometimes 2. 0 losses, 0 compromised operatives. The Sjöfugl had become one of the most reliable transport assets in Norwegian resistance operations, and most German patrol commanders knew the vessel by sight. They just didn't know what it was actually doing. To understand why Anderson's technique worked, you need to understand what he was up against. By 1943, the German Navy controlled Norwegian coastal waters with a level of sophistication that made traditional smuggling operations nearly impossible. This wasn't just patrol boats randomly sweeping the sea. This was systematic, layered defense in depth, designed to catch everything from Allied submarines to resistance fishing vessels. The system worked like this. Layer 1. Coastal radar. Every significant coastal position had radar stations tracking surface contacts out to 30 kilometers. The technology was crude by modern standards, prone to weather interference, couldn't distinguish vessel types reliably, but it could detect movement. Any vessel operating near the coast showed up as a radar contact. Those contacts were logged, tracked, and cross-referenced with civilian fishing permits. Layer 2. Patrol boats. Fast attack craft and converted fishing vessels, armed, operating in rotating patterns that covered every approach to the Norwegian coast. These vessels could respond to radar contacts within minutes, had authority to stop and search any civilian craft, and were explicitly ordered to treat coastal waters as hostile environments where any vessel might be smuggling weapons, refugees, or intelligence operatives. Layer 3. Air patrols. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, irregular but frequent, scanning for unusual activity. Any concentration of fishing vessels, any craft operating in unusual patterns, any signs of rendezvous at sea, all reported to naval intelligence. Layer 4. Informant networks. German intelligence cultivated collaborators in every fishing village. Harbor masters who reported unusual activity. Fishermen who mentioned boats that shouldn't be where they were. Casual observation turned into intelligence reports. Layer 5. Analysis. All of this data, radar contacts, patrol reports, air reconnaissance, informant intelligence, got collated at naval intelligence centers. Analysts looked for patterns. Vessels that appeared repeatedly in restricted zones. Captains whose movements didn't match legitimate fishing behavior. Any anomaly that suggested smuggling or resistance activity. The system was remarkably effective. Between April 1940 and January 1943, German coastal patrols had interdicted dozens of smuggling attempts. They'd captured Allied commandos trying to infiltrate by sea. They'd seized weapon shipments. They'd rolled up entire resistance cells by tracking fishing vessels to their contacts. Traditional smuggling doctrine, stay dark, move fast, avoid contact, was increasingly suicidal. Radar caught dark vessels. Speed attracted attention. And avoiding contact meant you had no legitimate explanation when patrol boats inevitably found you. British intelligence estimated that by 1943, any covert vessel making regular crossings to Norway had maybe a 40% chance of completing 10 runs without interdiction. Submarines could survive longer, but they were expensive, resource-intensive, and couldn't access shallow coastal waters where most resistance operations happened. The math was brutal. Resistance operations needed regular, reliable transport. But regular transport meant patterns. And patterns meant German intelligence could predict, intercept, and destroy. Multiple Allied operations had tried to solve the problem. Special Operations Executive had developed techniques for submarine insertions, but those were limited to high-value operations. The Norwegian resistance had tried using multiple boats in rotation to avoid pattern recognition, but rotating vessels meant rotating crews, and unfamiliar captains meant higher risk of mistakes. Some operations had tried going completely dark. No lights, no radio, minimal activity, but radar made that increasingly ineffective. The fundamental problem remained. You couldn't hide regular activity. The more crossings you made, the more data German intelligence collected. Eventually, analysis would identify patterns, predict movements, and position patrols to intercept. Unless you found a way to make your pattern look like legitimate civilian activity. That's what Anderson had figured out, not through tactical training or intelligence analysis, but through simple observation of how patrol boats actually behaved. They weren't looking for fishing boats. They were looking for boats pretending to be fishing boats. The suspicion focused on discrepancies, vessels in wrong locations, unusual timing, nervous captains, inconsistent stories. But actual fishing boats? The ones genuinely trying to catch cod despite German regulations? Those were so common, so annoying, so mundanely persistent that patrol commanders developed a kind of fatigue. After the 10th time stopping the same stubborn Norwegian complaining about the same fuel costs, the psychological tendency was to categorize that vessel as a known nuisance, not a potential threat. Anderson had weaponized that fatigue. By March 1943, the Sjöfågel appeared in German patrol logs, an average of 3.7 times per month. Each log entry noted the vessel, the captain, the location, and the results of inspection. Civilian fishing vessel, Captain Henrik Andersen, no suspicious cargo. Verbal warning issued regarding restricted zone violations. Pattern recognition algorithms, the humankind, done by intelligence analysts reviewing stacks of patrol reports, had long since categorized the Sjöfågel as low priority. Known vessel, known captain. Chronically non-compliant with fishing regulations, but no evidence of smuggling activity. The analysts had no idea that in 23 months of operation, Henrik Andersen had transported 147 resistance operatives, delivered 17 tons of weapons and radio equipment, and carried intelligence packages that contributed to the planning of multiple Allied operations in occupied Norway. 0 interdictions, 0 compromised operations, 0 losses. The technique worked because it exploited a fundamental limitation in German coastal security. They had the resources to closely monitor suspicious vessels, but they couldn't afford to treat every civilian boat like a major threat. The system relied on categorization, sorting vessels into threat levels and allocating investigation resources accordingly. Andersen had figured out how to get categorized wrong. But by March 1943, he was about to attempt something that would push his technique to its absolute limit. Smuggling 17 resistance operatives in a single crossing. Not refugees, not low-priority contacts, but trained intelligence operators, some with detailed knowledge of German coastal defenses, some with radio codes, some with information that could compromise ongoing operations if captured. British SOE had argued against it. Too many assets in one vessel, the briefing officer had said. If you're intercepted, we lose 17 trained operatives. That's not acceptable risk management. Andersen's response had been characteristically blunt. If I run 17 separate crossings, probability says German intelligence will notice the pattern. Running them all at once, we make one crossing that looks like every other crossing I've done, which is actually safer. The mathematics supported him. One crossing, even with 17 operatives, generated the same volume of intelligence data as any other crossing. One radar contact, one potential patrol boat interaction, one set of log entries. 17 separate crossings generated 17 times the data, 17 times the opportunity for something to go wrong, 17 times the chance that German analysts would notice an uptick in Sjöfågel activity correlating with other intelligence indicators. SOE had reluctantly approved the operation. Not because they agreed with the logic institutional doctrine still said concentrating assets like this was reckless, but because alternatives were worse. These 17 operatives needed to get into Norway. Submarine insertion would take weeks to coordinate and might not reach the coastal locations needed. Multiple smaller crossings risked pattern recognition. And importantly, Andersen had never failed a crossing. 23 months, dozens of operations, 0 losses. Sometimes, institutional resistance to unconventional tactics gave way to simple results. On March 14, 1943, Henrik Andersen loaded 17 of Norway's most valuable intelligence assets into the hold of a fishing trawler worth maybe 800 pounds, and set course for occupied territory using tactics that British naval doctrine considered somewhere between unprofessional and insane. 12 nautical miles from shore, 3 German patrol boats detected his radar signature and moved to intercept. The diesel engine's misfire pattern was everything. Too regular, and it sounded like deliberate sabotage, something a smuggler might fake to explain slow speed. Too irregular, and it suggested genuine mechanical failure that would warrant German investigation and potential towing to a port facility where thorough inspection would be inevitable. Andersen had spent 18 months calibrating the exact rhythm. 3 normal combustion cycles, 1 partial misfire, 2 normal cycles, 1 complete misfire, 4 normal cycles. The pattern created a distinctive sound, a coughing, struggling engine that suggested poor maintenance and fuel quality issues, but not critical failure. The kind of mechanical problem that made patrol boat commanders roll their eyes and mutter about stubborn Norwegians too cheap to properly maintain their vessels. It was, essentially, sonic camouflage. The sound itself communicated poverty, incompetence, and the grinding persistence of working-class fishermen who couldn't afford to stop working even when their equipment was falling apart. The actual engine was running perfectly. The misfires were controlled, a modified fuel injection system that Anderson had designed himself, allowing precise timing of incomplete combustion cycles. He could switch it off with 1 lever pull, restoring full power instantly if needed. But tonight, 1,100 meters from 3 German patrol boats, whose searchlights swept methodically across black water, full power meant nothing. Speed would confirm suspicion. The only thing keeping 17 resistance operatives alive was the believable performance of mechanical inadequacy. Through the gap in the hull planking, Anderson watched the searchlight beams. They moved in coordination 3 boats, overlapping search patterns, professionally executed. These weren't reserve conscripts on routine patrol. This was active interdiction. They detected something that warranted serious investigation. Maybe radar contact in a restricted zone. Maybe intelligence reports suggesting increased resistance activity. Maybe just random chance, wrong place, wrong time, wrong night to be smuggling the equivalent of an entire intelligence network. The lead patrol boat's searchlight locked onto the Sjöfugl. Anderson didn't change course, didn't reduce speed. The engine continued its labored, misfiring rhythm. He reached for the forward cargo net, pulled himself upright, and stepped out onto the deck. Visibility was maybe 200 meters in the darkness and ocean spray. Cold wind cut through his wool coat. The patrol boat's searchlights turned night into artificial day, transforming the Sjöfugl's weathered deck into a stage. Anderson shielded his eyes against the glare and waved, not frantically, not nervously, just the tired acknowledgement of someone who'd been through this routine too many times and found it mostly annoying. A loudspeaker crackled from the nearest patrol boat. German heavily accented. "Stop your engine. Prepare for inspection." Anderson cupped his hands and shouted back in Norwegian, "Engine's barely running as it is. If I stop it, I'm drifting." Below deck, in the cargo hold, 17 people waited in absolute silence. They'd been briefed extensively. If German sailors came aboard, if inspection became inevitable, the protocol was simple. Don't move, don't breathe loudly, don't make any sound that could penetrate the canvas, partitions, and diesel-soaked fabric layers that separated the hidden compartment from the legitimate cargo hold. The partitions were Anderson's innovation. Not just canvas, but treated canvas, soaked in diesel fuel, fish oil, and creosote, creating an overwhelming olfactory barrier. German patrol procedures included dogs trained to detect human scent. The treated fabric masked that scent completely, but it also meant 17 people were breathing through cloth filters in an enclosed space reeking of chemicals and fish waste. Anderson had tested the system extensively. 60 minutes was manageable, 90 minutes pushed limits. Beyond that, people started experiencing symptoms, dizziness, nausea, disorientation from the fumes. They'd been in the hold for 43 minutes. Anderson needed this inspection over quickly. The patrol boat drew alongside. 50 meters, 40, 30. Close enough that Anderson could see individual German sailors on deck, weapons ready. The officer in command, visible on the bridge through the searchlight glare, raised a megaphone. "Identify your vessel." "Sjöfugl, Bergen Registry, Captain Anderson." Even across 30 meters of dark water, Anderson could see the officer's posture change slightly. Recognition. The name meant something. The vessel was logged, tracked, familiar. "You're operating in a restricted zone, Captain Anderson." "I'm following cod migration. Fish don't care about your restrictions." The exchange was theatrical, almost scripted. Anderson and various German patrol commanders had performed variations of this dialogue dozens of times. The pattern was familiar. German officer asserts authority. Norwegian captain complains about economic necessity. Brief argument. Perfunctory inspection or verbal warning. Everyone moves on. But tonight felt different. The officer wasn't immediately escalating to inspection, but he wasn't dismissing the encounter either. The patrol boats maintained position. Searchlights steady. Evaluating. Anderson needed to push the interaction toward resolution. Not aggressively, that would trigger suspicion, but with the kind of annoyed insistence that suggested he genuinely had fishing to do and considered this entire encounter a waste of valuable time. "I've lost 40 minutes already," Anderson shouted. "If you're boarding, board. If not, I've got nets to pull." Professional military doctrine would say he was being reckless. You don't demand patrol boats. Hurry up. You comply. Stay polite. Minimize interaction. But Anderson had learned that patrol commanders responded to specific psychological cues. Nervousness suggested guilt. Excessive politeness suggested hiding something. But irritation? Annoyed insistence that you had legitimate work to do? That suggested someone who genuinely believed they had nothing to hide. The officer on the patrol boat conferred with someone on the bridge. 30 seconds. 45. The searchlights didn't waver. Below deck, 17 people breathed through cloth filters, surrounded by diesel fumes, waiting. Anderson stood on the deck, one hand shielding his eyes, maintaining perfect body language. Tired, annoyed, but not nervous. He'd rehearsed this posture until it was instinctive. You couldn't fake relaxation. The human nervous system betrayed deception through micro-expressions, postural tension, breathing patterns. So Anderson didn't fake it. He genuinely believed, at a fundamental psychological level, that he was just a fishing captain dealing with one more bureaucratic annoyance. The cognitive dissonance was remarkable. Consciously aware he was smuggling 17 intelligence operatives, while simultaneously inhabiting the emotional reality of a civilian fisherman annoyed at military interference. The mental state required absolute compartmentalization, maintaining two incompatible psychological frameworks simultaneously. It was, in its own way, a kind of method acting. And like all effective acting, it worked because the performer believed the performance. The German officer lowered his megaphone and issued orders to his crew. The patrol boat's engine note changed. For 3 seconds, Anderson couldn't read the intention. Were they coming alongside for inspection? Were they preparing to? The patrol boat turned away. Not rapidly, not dramatically, just a professional course correction, searchlight sweeping onward to the next sector, leaving the shuffle coughing and sputtering in their wake. No boarding, no inspection, just one more log entry. Show fool, Captain Anderson. Verbal warning issued. Vessel permitted to continue. Anderson waited until the patrol boats were 300 meters distant before moving. He walked calmly to the cargo hold hatch, knocked twice the all-clear signal, and descended the ladder. Below deck, 17 people gradually removed their breathing filters. The diesel fume barrier had done its job, but the space reeked. Several operatives were visibly nauseous, disoriented from prolonged chemical exposure. 20 minutes to shore, Anderson told them quietly. Stay down. Stay quiet. We're not safe yet. Christian Berge, one of the senior resistance coordinators, a man with intelligence value that SOE had rated equivalent to a military battalion, leaned against the hull planking and managed a weak smile. You do this regularly? Twice a week, usually. Christ. And they never search? They searched the first 10 times, Anderson said. Then they got bored. It was an oversimplification, but not entirely inaccurate. The genius of aggressive innocence wasn't that it prevented inspection. It was that it made each inspection less thorough than the last, until eventually patrol commanders decided you weren't worth the time investment. 17 lives saved because German naval officers had better things to do than waste another hour searching a fishing boat captained by that annoying Norwegian who never had anything suspicious aboard. The Shuffle's engine continued its misfiring rhythm as they approached the coast. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, resistance contacts waited at a predetermined beach landing site. Somewhere behind, German radar stations logged one more civilian fishing vessel returning to port. Somewhere in between those realities, Henrik Andersen navigated the gap between what appeared to be happening and what was actually happening. The gap where improvised technique outperformed professional doctrine. The gap where aggressive innocence defeated systematic surveillance. The gap that only existed because a carpenter's son from Bergen had asked a simple question 18 months earlier. What if we stopped hiding? The beach landing site was a calculated risk wrapped in geographic necessity. Most resistance insertions happened at remote locations, isolated coves, rocky coastlines with minimal German presence, places where you could offload personnel and equipment without observation. But those locations required operatives to travel significant distances overland to reach their operational areas, increasing exposure time and interdiction risk. Andersen had argued for something different. Insert directly into populated areas during normal fishing hours, using legitimate civilian traffic as camouflage. The concept violated every covert operations principle. You didn't infiltrate agents in broad daylight in the middle of civilian activity. The exposure risk was absurd. Except, Andersen had pointed out, German security forces monitored remote areas specifically because that's where they expected infiltration to occur. Coastal areas near fishing villages during normal operations? Those were so saturated with civilian activity that identifying individual threats became nearly impossible. Tonight's landing site was a small beach outside Kristiansand, used by local fishing crews to haul their boats ashore for maintenance. At 12:17 a.m., it would be completely empty, too late for legitimate fishing activity, too early for dawn departures. But in the context of Andersen's established pattern of night fishing in restricted zones, returning to this beach at this hour would appear consistent with his usual disregard for regulations, not evidence of covert activity. The Schaufuhl approached the beach at 4 knots, engine still misfiring, navigation lights visible. Standard procedure for a fishing vessel returning to shore. Nothing unusual, nothing worth investigating. On the beach, 3 resistance contacts waited in the darkness. They'd verified the area was clear, no German patrols within 2 kilometers, no observation posts with direct line of sight. The window was narrow, 20 minutes maximum to offload 17 operatives and get the Schaufuhl back to open water before the next scheduled patrol sweep. Andersen brought the trawler into the shallows, cut the engine, and dropped anchor. The sudden silence felt massive after hours of controlled misfiring. In the cargo hold, 17 people prepared to disembark. The procedure was choreographed with the precision of a tactical operation. Operatives exited the hold in pairs, 60 seconds apart, moving directly from the vessel to the beach where resistance contacts guided them to predetermined dispersal points. No clustering, no delays, no conversation beyond essential coordination. Christian Berge was the 5th to disembark. He paused briefly on the deck, looked at Andersen, and extended his hand. "Thank you." Andersen shook it. "Get off my boat. You've got work to do." It wasn't callousness. It was professional compartmentalization. Every second these operatives spent visible on the beach increased risk. Gratitude could wait. Survival came first. By 12:34 a.m., all 17 operatives had dispersed into the darkness, guided by local resistance contacts who would shepherd them to safe houses throughout southern Norway. By morning, they'd be embedded in their cover identities, beginning the intelligence-gathering operations that SOE and Norwegian High Command had been planning for 6 months. Andersen didn't wait to confirm their safety. That wasn't his responsibility. His job was transport, getting them here alive. The rest belonged to other parts of the resistance network. He restarted the Schaufuhl's engine still misfiring, maintaining the audible signature, and began the return journey to open water. Behind him, the beach returned to darkness and silence. In 48 hours, it would be filled with fishing crews working on their vessels, completely unaware that 17 Allied intelligence operatives had infiltrated through that exact location. Hidden in plain sight. Invisible because nobody was looking. The return crossing was uneventful. Anderson maintained his usual pattern, same routes, same fishing areas, same annoyed indifference to German regulations. By 3:15 a.m., he was 12 nautical miles offshore, alone in the darkness, with nothing to indicate tonight had been anything other than another frustrating fishing expedition that had wasted fuel and caught no cod. The Shuffle would be back in Bergen Harbor by dawn. German harbor authorities would log his arrival, note the empty nets, possibly issue another warning about unauthorized fishing in restricted zones. The report would be filed with dozens of similar reports, one more entry in the ongoing documentation of Henrik Andersen's chronic inability to follow German fishing regulations. Deep in the naval intelligence files in Oslo, an analyst would review patrol reports and note that the Shuffle had been stopped and released at 11:47 p.m., near position 58 degrees north, 7 degrees east. The entry would be cross-referenced with previous encounters, nothing unusual, same pattern, same irritating Norwegian captain, no evidence of suspicious activity. The file would remain classified as low priority. Meanwhile, 17 intelligence operatives would begin operations that would map German coastal defenses, identify weapon storage facilities, document troop movements, and provide targeting data for Allied air operations. Information with strategic value that would contribute to the eventual liberation of Norway. All of it made possible because a carpenter's son with no Naval Academy training had figured out that the best camouflage wasn't invisibility, it was being so persistently, obviously civilian that enemy intelligence systems learned to ignore you. Between March 1943 and December 1944, Henrik Andersen completed 147 additional crossings using refined variations of aggressive innocence. The technique evolved. Not dramatically, the core principle remained consistent, but with incremental improvements based on operational experience. Andersen documented everything. Which patrol boat commanders responded to which approaches, which times of day produced the most perfunctory inspections, which types of cargo arrangements survived casual searches, which behavioral patterns generated the least scrutiny. By mid-1943, British SOE had begun training other operatives in Andersen's methods. Not the technical details, those required intimate knowledge of fishing vessels and Norwegian coastal waters, but the psychological framework, the concept of aggressive innocence as a viable infiltration doctrine. The training sessions were awkward. Andersen wasn't a natural instructor. He explained tactics using fishing metaphors that confused intelligence officers. He demonstrated the annoyed fisherman persona by actually getting annoyed when trainees asked what he considered obvious questions. But the results spoke clearly enough that SOE continued the program. 4 additional fishing boat captains adopted variations of the technique. 2 succeeded. One was detained after arousing suspicion through inconsistent behavior. He'd tried to fake the annoyed fisherman persona without actually understanding the mentality, and German patrol commanders detected the deception. Another simply lacked the mechanical knowledge to maintain convincing cover as a legitimate fishing captain. His vessel's engine actually failed during an inspection, leading to detention and investigation that, fortunately, found no evidence of resistance activity before his release. The failures reinforced what Andersen had been arguing from the beginning. Aggressive innocence wasn't just a tactic. It was a complete operational framework that required legitimate expertise in the cover identity you were performing. You couldn't fake being a fisherman. You had to actually be a fisherman who happened to also be smuggling intelligence operatives. British intelligence struggled with this conceptually. Traditional doctrine separated cover identities from operational identities. You were either a spy pretending to be a civilian or a civilian recruited to spy. The idea that you could be genuinely both authentically civilian while simultaneously conducting resistance operations didn't fit established categories. But Andersen kept demonstrating it worked. By August 1943, the Schofel had transported 214 resistance operatives with 0 interdictions. The statistical probability of that success rate through random chance was effectively impossible. German coastal security was too sophisticated, inspection protocols too thorough, intelligence analysis too comprehensive. The only explanation was that Anderson's technique was exploiting a genuine vulnerability in German security doctrine, one that conventional intelligence analysis had missed because it required understanding how patrol commanders actually made decisions, not how doctrine said they should make decisions. In September 1943, German naval intelligence in Oslo conducted a systematic review of coastal security effectiveness. The report examined interdiction rates, analyzed successful and failed infiltration attempts, and made recommendations for improving patrol procedures. The Schofel appeared in the report exactly once, in a section documenting chronic regulatory non-compliance by civilian fishing vessels. The entry noted that Captain Henrik Andersen had been stopped and warned 47 times in the preceding 12 months for fishing in restricted zones, with 0 evidence of smuggling or resistance activity. The report's recommendation: continue monitoring but reduce inspection frequency to conserve patrol resources for more credible threats. In other words, German naval intelligence had formally classified Henrik Andersen as not worth investigating thoroughly. That classification would remain in effect until the end of the war. The technique nearly failed completely on January 18, 1944. Andersen was running a standard insertion, 6 operatives. Destination north of Stavanger, routine crossing. Weather was poor but manageable, heavy overcast, moderate seas, visibility around 500 meters, conditions that made navigation more difficult but also reduced German patrol effectiveness. The initial approach went normally. 2 patrol boat encounters, both resolved through the standard routine, annoyed fishermen, verbal warnings, no inspection. By 10:40 p.m., Andersen was 8 nautical miles from the landing site, maintaining his usual misfiring engine signature. Then the Schofel's engine actually failed. Not the controlled misfiring pattern. Genuine mechanical failure. The fuel injection system, ironically, the same modified system Andersen used to create the misfiring camouflage, had developed a pressure fault that caused complete combustion failure. The engine died. The vessel began drifting. In the cargo hold, 6 operatives felt the sudden silence and understood immediately that something was wrong. Legitimate mechanical misfiring had a rhythm. Genuine failure was different, sudden, complete, final. Andersen tried restarting. The engine turned over but wouldn't fire. Fuel pressure issue. Probably a ruptured line in the injection manifold. Fixable, but it would take at least 40 minutes of work in darkness with minimal tools. 40 minutes of drifting 8 nautical miles from shore, completely immobile, in waters actively patrolled by German boats, whose doctrine explicitly treated disabled vessels as suspicious. The psychological irony was brutal. For 18 months, Andersen had faked mechanical problems so convincingly that German patrols dismissed him as incompetent. Now he had a genuine mechanical problem, and that problem would kill the camouflage that had kept him alive. Because disabled vessels got towed to port facilities. Port facilities meant thorough inspection. Thorough inspection meant finding 6 resistance operatives hidden in the cargo hold. Andersen made a decision in approximately 4 seconds. He couldn't fix the engine fast enough. He couldn't reach shore without power. His only option was to be legitimately what he'd been pretending to be, a fisherman with a broken engine who needed help. He activated the emergency radio and transmitted on the civilian distress frequency. Not coded, not covert, just standard maritime emergency protocol. Vessel disabled, position provided, requesting assistance. In the cargo hold, the 6 operatives understood what was happening. If German patrol boats responded to the distress call, if they towed the Schofel to port, the operation was compromised. Standard procedure in that scenario was to attempt covert escape, wait until the vessel was docked, then disperse separately into civilian populations. But Andersen had a different calculation. He'd been establishing his pattern for 18 months. Every German patrol commander in this sector knew the Schuffel. They'd searched it dozens of times. They'd found nothing dozens of times. By now, the vessel was psychologically classified as a nuisance, not a threat. The question was whether that psychological classification was strong enough to survive a tow to port. 17 minutes after the distress call, a German patrol boat arrived. The commander was a Kapitän Lieutenant named Müller Anderson, had encountered him at least 8 times previously. Professional, efficient, not particularly friendly, but not hostile either. Just a naval officer doing his job. "Engine failure, Anderson?" Müller called from the patrol boat's bridge. "Fuel injection system," Anderson shouted back. "I can fix it, but I need stable conditions. Can't work in these seas. We'll tow you to Stavanger. You can repair in harbor." This was the critical moment. Stavanger Harbor meant German-controlled port facilities, thorough inspection protocols, security procedures that would likely detect 6 people hidden in the cargo hold. Anderson needed to prevent the tow without arousing suspicion. "Stavanger's 30 kilometers. I'll lose an entire day of fishing. Just tow me to calmer water. I can make repairs and get back to work," Müller considered. Standard procedure was to tow disabled vessels to port. But Anderson's request was reasonable. It saved the patrol boat hours of towing time. And importantly, there was no indication of anything suspicious. Disabled fishing vessel, broken engine, stubborn Norwegian captain who wanted to minimize lost fishing time. All completely consistent with established pattern. 15 minutes, Müller said. "We'll tow you to the lee of that headland. If you can't get your engine running, you're going to Stavanger whether you like it or not." Anderson agreed. The patrol boat connected a tow line, and for 15 minutes the Schuffel moved through dark water, completely dependent on German naval assistance, carrying 6 intelligence operatives whose lives depended on whether Müller's crew decided to conduct even a cursory inspection. They didn't. The psychological pattern held. The Schuffel was a known vessel. Captain Anderson was a known nuisance. Broken engines were mundane civilian problems, not intelligence operations. Why would anyone bother inspecting a fishing boat you'd already searched 8 times and found nothing? At 11:22 p.m., the patrol boat released the tow in calmer water, wished Anderson luck with his repairs, and departed to continue patrol duties. Below deck, 6 operatives waited in absolute silence, while Anderson spent 43 minutes repairing the fuel injection system, using improvised tools and replacement parts he'd stored for exactly this kind of emergency. At 12:05 a.m., the engine restarted. At 1:40 a.m., 6 operatives successfully landed at their designated beach site. The operation was successful. 0 compromises, 0 losses. But it had been terrifyingly close. If Müller had decided to conduct even a basic inspection while the vessel was under tow, everything would have ended. Not just the operation, the entire 18-month pattern of successful crossings, the intelligence value of dozens of ongoing operations, the lives of hundreds of resistance operatives who depended on Anderson's transport capabilities. All of it nearly destroyed by an actual mechanical failure in the same system he'd been deliberately miscalibrating to fake mechanical problems. The irony wasn't lost on Anderson. That night, sitting in a Shetland safe house during his return debriefing, he told the SOE coordinator, "If I'd actually been a competent fisherman with properly maintained equipment, the Germans would have been more suspicious. They expect me to have mechanical problems. Tonight, having a real problem saved us." The coordinator wrote in his report, "Subject continues to demonstrate highly unconventional operational logic that nevertheless produces consistent results. Recommend continuing current protocols despite near-compromise incident." What the report didn't capture was the psychological exhaustion of maintaining aggressive innocence under those conditions. Anderson had spent 43 minutes repairing an engine while maintaining the casual body language of someone dealing with a minor mechanical annoyance, fully aware that 6 human lives depended on whether his hands shook, whether his voice showed strain, whether any micro-expression betrayed the terror of knowing that one German sailor looking in the wrong direction would end everything. Method acting taken to its absolute psychological limit. The technique worked, but the cost, the constant performance, the compartmentalized awareness, the maintenance of two incompatible psychological states simultaneously was immense. After January 1944, Anderson began training potential replacements, not because he wanted to stop, the operations were too important, but because he recognized that aggressive innocence required a specific psychological capacity that couldn't be sustained indefinitely. Eventually, the performance would crack. Better to have trained alternatives before that happened. In April 1945, after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence teams conducted extensive debriefings of captured German naval personnel. Among the documents recovered was the personal diary of Kapitän Lieutenant Dieter Müller, the patrol boat commander who had towed the Schuffel in January 1944. The diary entry for January 18, 1944, read, "Responded to distress call from that Norwegian fisherman Anderson again. Third time this month he's had engine problems. Either he's the unluckiest captain in Norway or too incompetent to maintain his vessel properly. Towed him to calmer water so he could make repairs. Waste of patrol time, but standard humanitarian protocol. Sometimes I wonder if these fishermen deliberately sabotage their own engines just to test our response times." Anderson seemed more annoyed about lost fishing time than grateful for assistance. Typical Norwegian stubbornness. The entry was remarkable for what it revealed about German threat assessment. Müller, a professional naval officer with 18 months of patrol experience, had encountered Anderson repeatedly, towed his disabled vessel, and concluded the man was either unlucky or incompetent. The possibility that Anderson was conducting sophisticated resistance operations never appeared in the analysis. Not because Müller was incompetent. His service record showed competent performance, multiple successful interdictions of actual smuggling operations, professional execution of patrol duties. He wasn't failing to identify threats. He was making reasonable assessments based on pattern recognition and resource allocation. The Schuffel had been categorized as low priority. That categorization was based on accumulated evidence. Dozens of encounters, dozens of inspections, 0 discoveries of suspicious activity. From Müller's perspective, continued intensive investigation of Anderson's vessel would be waste of limited patrol resources that could be better allocated to unknown vessels or those with suspicious profiles. The decision was logical, efficient, exactly what resource-constrained security forces should do. And it was completely wrong. Other diary entries and patrol reports revealed similar patterns. Multiple German commanders had encountered the Schuffel, logged the encounters, conducted inspections, and concluded the vessel was a known nuisance. Some entries contained frustrated notes about Anderson's attitude: argumentative, non-compliant, persistent regulatory violations. Several mentioned issuing warnings or minor fines for fishing in restricted zones. None mentioned suspicion of smuggling or resistance activity. The German intelligence failure wasn't tactical incompetence. It was systematic vulnerability to a technique that exploited how security forces actually make operational decisions. Threat assessment relies on pattern recognition. Resources get allocated based on probability. Known low-risk entities receive reduced scrutiny to conserve investigation capacity for unknown high-risk threats. Anderson had weaponized that vulnerability by deliberately constructing a pattern that signaled known low risk. Post-war analysis by British intelligence attempted to quantify the strategic impact. The Schuffel had transported 361 resistance operatives over 32 months. Those operatives had contributed to intelligence-gathering operations that influenced multiple Allied strategic decisions, provided targeting data for air operations, coordinated resistance activities, and maintained communication networks throughout occupied Norway. The operational value was assessed as equivalent to maintaining a small intelligence battalion in hostile territory for the duration of the war, except the resource cost was 1 fishing boat, 1 captain, and minimal support infrastructure. Cost-effectiveness analysis suggested it was one of the highest return intelligence operations of the European theater, not because of sophisticated technology or large-scale operations, but because Anderson had figured out how to hide in the cognitive blind spots of enemy security systems. Henrik Anderson completed his final crossing on April 29, 1945. By that point, German coastal security had collapsed, patrol boat operations were chaotic, and Norway's liberation was imminent. The crossing was symbolic more than operational, evacuating the last few resistance coordinators who needed to reach Allied-controlled territory before German surrender formalities. The Schuffel was stopped once during that final crossing. The German patrol boat commander, a young lieutenant who couldn't have been more than 22, asked for identification, logged the encounter, and waved Anderson through without even requesting inspection. The pattern had held until the very end. Total operational statistics: 361 resistance operatives transported, 0 interdictions, 0 compromised operations, 0 casualties. 32 months of active operations against one of the most sophisticated coastal security systems in World War II, using a technique so counterintuitive that British intelligence had initially classified it as tactically unsound. After the war, Anderson returned to Bergen and resumed his father's shipbuilding business. He rarely discussed his wartime activities. When asked, usually by historians or military researchers, he described the operations in practical, mechanical terms. "I fixed boats," he would say. "Sometimes I moved people. It wasn't complicated." The British government awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal in 1946. Norwegian resistance leadership gave him the Krigsmedaljen. He accepted both with polite appreciation and immediately returned to building fishing vessels. SOE attempted to document his techniques in classified training materials. The resulting manual, Aggressive Innocence, Covert Transport in High Surveillance Environments, was distributed to intelligence services throughout NATO during the early Cold War. The doctrine influenced multiple operations, though very few achieved Anderson's success rate, because the technique wasn't just about specific tactics. It was about psychological compartmentalization, authentic cover identity performance, and exploiting the gap between how security systems were designed to work and how human operators actually made decisions under resource constraints. You couldn't teach that in a manual. You could only demonstrate it through sustained operational success. Dieter Müller, the German patrol boat commander who had unknowingly helped save 6 resistance operatives in January 1944, survived the war and eventually learned what he'd actually encountered during those patrol interactions. In a 1967 interview, he was asked whether he felt deceived. "Not deceived," Müller said. "Outwitted. There's a difference. Anderson wasn't lying about being a fisherman. He was a fisherman. He just also happened to be transporting intelligence operatives. We were looking for people pretending to be something they weren't. He actually was what he appeared to be, just not only that. The distinction captured the essence of aggressive innocence. You didn't hide by pretending to be civilian. You hid by actually being civilian while also conducting operations. The cover identity wasn't false, it was genuine. The operations were the hidden layer, not the visible identity." By 1972, Henrik Anderson's technique had been analyzed in 17 academic papers, 6 military training manuals, and multiple intelligence agency assessments. The consensus was that it represented a significant innovation in covert operations doctrine, exploiting the intersection of pattern recognition, resource allocation, and human psychological tendency to categorize repeated stimuli as familiar and non-threatening. Some analysts called it genius. Others called it lucky improvisation that happened to work. Anderson's own assessment, given in one of his rare interviews in 1978, was characteristically practical. "I just paid attention to how patrol boats actually behaved, not how doctrine said they should behave. Sometimes the gap between those two things is where you find room to work." He died in 1994, at age 82, having spent the final 4 decades of his life building fishing vessels in Bergen. His obituary in the Norwegian press mentioned his wartime service briefly, resistance operations, decorated by multiple governments, before spending considerably more space discussing his contributions to fishing vessel design and his mentorship of young shipwrights. The Sjøfugl survived the war and continued operating as a fishing vessel until 1961, when it was retired and eventually preserved in the Norwegian Resistance Museum in Oslo. The placard describing the vessel reads, "Between 1941 and 1945, this fishing trawler transported 361 resistance operatives and hundreds of intelligence packages through German-controlled waters. It was stopped and inspected by German patrol boats 127 times. 0 operations were compromised. The vessel's success was due to Captain Henrik Andersen's technique of aggressive innocence, deliberately acting so consistently civilian that German naval intelligence classified the boat as a low-priority threat, allowing it to operate undetected for the entire war." Visitors to the museum can walk through the cargo hold where resistance operatives hid behind diesel-soaked canvas partitions. They can see the modified fuel injection system that created the misfiring engine signature. They can read patrol reports from German archives documenting encounters with Captain Andersen and the consistent assessment that he was a regulatory nuisance, not a security threat. What they can't see, what no museum exhibit can adequately demonstrate, is the psychological precision required to maintain aggressive innocence under sustained operational pressure. The compartmentalized awareness, the authentic performance of civilian identity while simultaneously conducting resistance operations, the ability to be genuinely annoyed at patrol boat delays while knowing that delay might be the only thing preventing discovery of hidden operatives. That aspect of Andersen's technique died with him. The tactics could be documented. The psychological framework could be taught. But the sustained execution, 32 months of perfect performance with 0 failures, remained unique. Modern intelligence training still studies the Sjøfugl operations as a case study in covert transport. Special forces schools teach variations of aggressive innocence as an infiltration doctrine. Security analysts use Andersen's success as an example of how even sophisticated surveillance systems have exploitable vulnerabilities. But no operation since has matched his record. 361 transports, 0 losses, 1 fishing boat, 1 carpenter's son who understood that sometimes the best way to hide is to be exactly what you appear to be, just not only that. In 2019, a team of behavioral psychologists and military historians conducted a detailed analysis of Andersen's technique, attempting to quantify why it worked when conventional covert operations doctrine said it shouldn't. Their conclusion centered on what they termed authenticity paradox. Security systems are optimized to detect deception, but struggle to identify genuine identities that also serve operational purposes. Andersen wasn't pretending to be a fisherman. He was actually a fisherman. The fishing activity wasn't cover, it was real. The resistance operations were the hidden layer, but they existed within an authentic civilian framework. German patrol boats were designed to catch people pretending to be fishermen. They had protocols for identifying false identities, suspicious behavior, nervous body language. What they didn't have, what most security systems don't have, are reliable methods for distinguishing between genuine civilians and genuine civilians who also conduct covert operations. The distinction is subtle but critical. Traditional infiltration requires maintaining a false identity under scrutiny. Aggressive innocence requires no false identity, only hidden purpose within authentic activity. Modern applications of the technique appear in multiple contexts. Aid organizations operating in conflict zones use variations to maintain humanitarian access while gathering intelligence. Journalists embed with civilian populations while conducting investigations. Business operations in hostile regulatory environments maintain legitimate commercial activity while pursuing restricted objectives. The ethical implications are complex and situational, but the tactical principle remains. Authenticity is more durable than deception because it doesn't require sustained performance of something you're not. Henrik Anderson understood this instinctively. He didn't try to fake being a fisherman good enough to fool German patrols. He was actually a fisherman, one who also transported resistance operatives. The patrols weren't fooled because there was nothing false to detect. They simply missed the hidden layer because their detection systems weren't designed to find genuine civilians conducting operations. It's a technique that only works in specific contexts with particular psychological capacities. Not everyone can maintain compartmentalized awareness. Not everyone can perform authentic civilian identity while conducting high-risk operations. Not everyone has the technical expertise to make their cover identity genuinely legitimate. But for those who can, for operations where authentic civilian presence provides operational access, the principle remains powerful. Sometimes the best camouflage isn't invisibility. Sometimes it's being exactly what you appear to be. Just not only that,